as discussed in the Techbrarian Journal, two teenagers created a game called Bias Breaker, where some alternative players against traditional stereotypes went around and destroyed negative stereotypes. We also watched this tutorial by Warfame about how to create a first-person shooter. So now it's our turn. We're going to go onto Scratch, and we're going to begin by creating a sprite, and that sprite is going to be our shooter. So we're going to make a circle here. Maybe we'll fill it in with a color. And we're going to create, that's its head actually, and then we're going to create arms coming out. And even though I don't like guns or anything having to do with shooting, we are going to be making a gun sticking out of its arms. And it's going to look like that. And I'll fill it in with a darker gray. Okay, so now we have our guy who's walking around, or girl who's walking around being a shooter. Shame on them, but at least they're shooting down stereotypes. Next, we're going to create a script so that their arms move left and move right. And the way that we're going to do this is by saying, when I press the green flag, I want you to forever look for something. Not just once, but forever look for if this thing. And what is this thing? I want you to sense whether or not the left arrow is pressed. If you press the left arrow, then go to motion. I want you to turn 5 degrees. So let's check that out. And now I want to do the same thing, but this time, if I press the right arrow, so we go back to sensing, if the right key is pressed, then I want you to turn right. Okay, so let's just try this out. Looks good. Now we're going to make the code for it to move forward. And we'll do that by saying one last set of code, and that is if the up arrow key is pressed, then move, let's say we don't want it to move too fast, so we'll say 3 steps. So let's look at that. And we're just gonna move around like that. We're not going to have the down arrow do anything. So before we go any farther, a really good habit is always to name your sprites. We're gonna press this I right here, and we're gonna call this the blaster. We're going to call the whole thing the brainwash blaster. So this is our blaster, and then we're gonna press this arrow again to return back. Just so you know, in case it's not clear, we're looking above. So this is the head from above, this is the arms from above, the gun from above. And now we're gonna create the bullets. So let's click on this circle, let's make it solid over here, and let's go right over into the center, and don't make the bullets too big. So I'll make it about that big. And now let's do an I right here and call this bullet. Okay. Time to write the code for the bullet. I'm going to press events. When I press the green flag, go to looks, hide. Why am I making it hide? Because nothing's been shot yet. So you don't want to have a bullet appear until something is shot. Now here's the sort of challenging thing to understand. What we're dealing with for the bullets are clones. We're not going to create a separate sprite every time we want to fire a bullet. Otherwise, you're going to be creating a million sprites. And you don't need to do that because of something called a clone. We're going to have a clone of the bullet created every time the spacebar is pressed. We'll be putting the spacebar code back on the blaster in a moment. But for now, what you need to know is once this bullet appears as a clone, it'll be its very first time appearing, but it'll still be a clone. Once it's created as a clone, the first thing that it needs to do is go to the gun. Therefore, when I start as a clone, I go to looks, I show myself, and then inside of motion, I go to the blaster. And once I go to the blaster, I need to make sure that as I'm firing, I'm facing the right direction, because this is constantly switching directions. So I want to not only go to the blaster, but also point in the direction of where the blaster is pointed. To do that, you're going to go to motion, and you're going to say point in direction. Then we're going to do this little slightly tricky code. We're going to go down to here where it says X position of bullet, and we're going to change that to direction of blaster. So we're going to point in the direction of the blaster. So for instance, here the blaster is pointed this way, and now the pointer's blast is pointing this way. So we're going to go to the blaster, point in the direction of the blaster, and then we're going to begin moving. And in order to do that, we're going to do this code here, which says that I want you to repeat moving forward. So repeat moving forward until you reach the edge. So this is under the sense block, and we're going to say we're going to repeat this until we're touching the edge. And finally, once we do touch the edge, we're going to disappear. And in order to do that, we're going to go to Control and delete this clone. So every time we press the space bar, this whole process is going to start. It's going to show, it's going to go to the blaster, point in the direction of the blaster, and it's going to keep moving until it reaches the edge and then die off, delete the clone. So the final step is really just to get the blaster to create the clone. And this is the code for that. If key space is pressed, then create the clone of the bullet. And we're going to have it just wait a second so that we don't fire too often. So let's test it out. Okay. Not that realistic, and there's a reason why. Do you see how the bullet is starting right here at the top of its head? Let's get it, instead of starting here, which is the center of this sprite, let's have it start about, this looks to me about 100 steps in front. So let's try going to the bullet, and we'll say when I start a clone, go to the blaster, point in the direction of the blaster, and let's move 20 steps, even before I start moving. 100 steps. Let's see how that looks. That's better. Okay, there's so many more ways to make this perfect, but this is pretty good. So this is part 1 of the tutorial. In part 2, we're going to show how to get some people to shoot. And who are we shooting? Stereotypes.